Welcome to another edition of the RedTech Briefing. I'm delighted to have as my guest today Veit Dengler, who until recently was the COO of Bauer Media Group. He was responsible for the group's entire business operations, but fundamentally the responsibility for the digital transformation of the radio and magazines business. And that, of course, is an extremely relevant place to be that he was in, and relevant to the RedTech Summit coming up, of which I'll tell you a bit more in a little while. He was also CEO of the NZZ Media Group, chairman of Google's Digital News Innovation Fund, and is now a visiting fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. Importantly, he's the facilitator of day one of the strategy day at the RedTech Summit, which is in Paris on the 2nd of June. And for those who are not aware, the RedTech Summit is inaugural this year. It's the first time we're doing it. It's a two-day event. 25 C-suite executives from radio networks and some over-the-top operators from around the world are attending. And the key issues that we're grappling with is what matters to those who are running these networks today. And that is the issue of scaling their digital businesses to compete effectively for advertising and audiences. And you know that most people who listen today and the new generation that's listening, their primary device for news, information, and entertainment is most likely to be a device connected to the internet. So we're delighted that you've agreed to facilitate that day one, Veit. It's going to be a challenge because you're going to have all of these competing wisdoms in the room from the C-suite executives, and they come from all over the world, probably at different levels of evolution in their markets. But there's no question that when we were doing the research for setting up the summit and its agenda, everyone, whether they come from India, or whether they were from Africa, whether from Europe or the US or Canada, Australia, they were all saying, this is the issue we're grappling with. We think our strategy is incremental when it comes to digital. We're not sure when the big switch happens. Currently, we're doing little bits just to stay what they call relevant. But eventually, they're going to be overtaken, and they are currently being overtaken by a lot of other operators who are natively in the IP space. So, like I said, you've got a tremendous task at hand. And that day one, where you're facilitating the entire day with all of these C-suite executives, what are you hoping to bring to it?
So thank you, Omar, for the introduction, and thanks for organizing the summit. I look forward to it. I think it's always great, especially after 2 years of COVID, to bring 25 people together, such an international group, to talk about what's really important for the industry. Now, you've already talked about it briefly. We are in the midst of a massive transition from FM or even AM to IP, and it fundamentally changes the game for the radio business, as we all know. Right. So one of the biggest ones is we were pretty much in control of our distribution. There was limited spectrum, so there was a limited number of competitors that we worked with or against and that we competed with. And this is all dissolving in a new world where on IP there is endless spectrum, endless supply, if you will. And competitors that we didn't think of competitors maybe even a few years ago, but who are now very clearly competing for the one currency that really matters, which is the attention of the audience.
Yes. And what sort of areas does one need to focus on? Because it sounds like you have to reinvent or rethink the way you run a business, because the problem with, as you said, when we were in a limited spectrum environment, I think everybody focused on a small range of competitors. Now it's open. Your audience is potentially global, although you need to think, I think, local to continue to be relevant. But what are the kinds of areas that one needs to hone in on as one tries to succeed at this challenge?
Yeah, so I think if you look at it, if you take 3 steps back, I remember the first time I dealt with this industry is a decade ago, when I joined the NZZ Media Group and their regional radio stations in Switzerland. And I asked sort of, how does the radio business model work? And they said, well, essentially, it's really simple. You need a good programming person and you need a good salesperson, and that's it. And it was quite a simple model, yes. And then we had to manage our distribution, the towers, etc. But, that was usually done with others, and it was relatively straightforward in terms of technology. Now what we see is we're competing on IP, and we're competing for attention, which means we have to develop skills that we never used to have to think about before. So we basically have to manage a funnel of people that are first attracted to our websites or our properties, and that we can then work to retain and make sure that they become repeat visitors. And it's a whole different skill set. And the difficult thing for this industry is it used to be quite a cottage industry or a niche industry. Now we're competing for talent against people that are doing very, very different things, but it's always the same game, which is how do you attract audiences and how do you retain audiences?
Yeah. And how do you monetize them? So when you start the day on the 2nd of June, is it initially looking at the business model, fundamentally questioning whether that business model is still relevant, and then progressing from there?
Yeah. And yes, I think that's how we'll kick it off. And I think sort of the summit, it's very important, I think, for everybody. This is a discussion platform. So it's not that you or I or somebody else are going to stand up front and present a lot of things, and then we have a Q&A at the end. I think this needs to be an interactive session, because I think what we all need to wrestle with is the question of how does this business model change, which was very predictable in the past and now looks very different. Now, I think there's a lot of good news stories in there as well. I think I'm actually quite bullish about the future of radio, but I think we will start with exploring what are the challenges to the business model and what are new revenue sources that we could tap into that we haven't tapped into in the past. Now, in combination with that, I think a really interesting question is, if we think about it, more and more of our listeners will listen, as you said, on mobile. They will stream us. Well, they could also stream video. So what's the delineation of our business compared to other audio businesses, such as podcasting and other platforms, as well as against video businesses? I mean, you can listen to YouTube while you walk down the street. You don't have to listen to a radio station, right? So I think sort of looking at this, dissolving borders between competitors and teasing out what are the really relevant competitors and the people we have to think about, I think that'll be a good introduction for the day. And that brings us then to the next session, which is about the business model itself and the monetization of audiences, right? And I think, how do we have to think about sales in the future? How much of it will be automated sales platforms? What's the role of a direct sales force? I think that'll be very relevant. And then we also, I think, should spend a little bit of time thinking about audience measurement, which is a very interesting topic. It's quite arcane. So, a lot of countries still have diary systems, which is very arcane. And a lot of countries have moved to metering in some form or another on your mobile device. And we've got some interesting case studies. Maybe Sweden would be one of the obvious ones, where the transition has been so badly managed by the companies that measure audiences that it posed a real business model problem for the businesses. So I think that's something that we may want to look into a little bit more. And then looking forward is, what is the right measurement and the right metric for our business? And that is absolutely critical for our business model transition.
And of course, none of this happens. None of these businesses succeed without talent. And I'm assuming you're going to spend some time thinking about how the organizations are currently structured from a people point of view, and what changes, what needs to change, or if anything needs to change at all. I have no idea, but that's going to be part of the conversation that I assume you're going to have.
I think so, because I think radio has an interesting problem that other businesses have had in the past, which is we have the existing radio structure. And then I think what many companies did, and certainly we did at Bauer, is we bolted on a team that thought about digital or that thought about new initiatives. And the question is, that may be meaningful or the right way to do it in the beginning, but is this really the right setup for an organization? Do we actually need the digital skill set in the core of the business? Do we need to think about programming in a different way? Do we need to definitely think about sales in a different way? So how do we organizationally structure it? Which leads us to the question of, how do you then manage the operations? And that leads us to the fundamental question of, what kind of talent do we need? I mean, we certainly need talent that we never ever had before. And when you're competing with the Googles of the world, can we afford this talent? What's the reason why this type of talent would come to us and not to other companies? So I think that's a really interesting question. I do think that the answer of having an existing FM business, and then having a small digital team and a small maybe podcasting team sitting somewhere off in the corner, that's probably not a very good setup for the future.
And that's how it's been in the past. And clearly that's one of the reasons, because it's not a fundamental part of the business. That's one of the reasons it's stayed on the margins, and we haven't been able to scale in many of the operations that are run around the world today. And then, when you talked about this issue of what's happening on YouTube or what Google are doing, it sounds to me like in the past, again, people in radio tended to see the enemy as others in radio, they didn't collaborate enough. Today, they potentially might be seeing the enemy as YouTube or the enemy as Spotify. Is there part of the conversation that you're going to have? Is there a need for a bit more of an open attitude, a bit more of a collaborative approach with peer group in your own country, but also with potential competitors, TikTok? Does that matter? Is that fundamental to the conversation?
I think that matters. If you look, on the horizon, I think there is a fundamental danger for the radio business, which is in the past, spectrum was available, you could bid for it, you got a license for it, and then there was a network where you could broadcast over. What happens in the new world increasingly is that there's a couple of very strong gatekeepers that are the platforms. So this could be Alexa, could be Siri, but there's not many of them. And if you think about it, technically, they can very quickly kill the radio business because they could do dynamic ad insertion and replace whatever ads that we have in our streams, and our business is dead, right? So this leads to a really interesting question about creating a level playing field where radio can still compete. So questions like, is there a must-carry provision or not for these type of platforms? As we know from other media industries such as cable. And in that context, I think it will be worth looking a little bit in more detail about at the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, which are two very significant new legislative initiatives by the European Union that are about to be finalized. When I was at Bauer, we played a very significant role in trying to marshal the radio industry across Europe to make sure that we get the outcomes that we need to survive as an industry. Because let's face it, if that goes the wrong way and gatekeepers can do whatever they want with the streams we supply, we don't have a business anymore. So I think regulation was always important in the radio businesses because we were bidding for spectrum and we needed licenses, etc. Now I think there's a whole new level of potential threat and potential regulatory issues that we have to deal with.
Veit, this sounds like it's going to be an amazing summit. I'm going to be there, of course, and accompanied by 25 other C-suite executives from almost everywhere in the world, which is tremendous. It's going to be a very rich conversation and hopefully result in the profound changes that need to happen in order to accelerate the process of this industry growing. And I think that's what we've committed as RedTech. We've said this is not a talk shop. Every delegate attending must leave with an action plan, with ideas that they can go back to their home countries and implement to ensure the future of the business. Veit, it's going to be tremendous. Looking forward to having you there.
Thank you, Omar. And I think I'm going to have one appeal to all the participants. This is participant sport. This is not a lean back kind of event. And what would be really valuable for everybody, if everybody thought of some things that they have tried to do in the past that either were successful, that might be interesting for others to copy. Because let's face it, we don't compete that much across country borders or even across continents. So it's actually easy for us to share in this environment. But also to come with examples of things that we've tried and didn't work. Because I think we always learn a lot from successes, but we learn even more from failures. And the more that participants are willing and able to share those stories, I think the more interesting and meaty the meeting will become. So looking forward to it a lot, and thanks for inviting me.
Without question, Veit. And just if I can add one last point, because we've kept it so tight, because of the nature of the fact that we're doing more of a workshop rather than a lecture or a presentation, many people who've wanted to attend can't be there. But the good news is we'll do, yourself, Veit, probably working with us, we'll do some key takeouts that many of those who couldn't attend will be able to read in our RedTech newsletter and the RedTech magazine and the RedTech website. So there's still an opportunity for people to benefit from all of the good, rich conversation that's going to happen over the 2 days. Thanks so much. Looking forward to seeing you in Paris.
Great. Thank you. Looking forward.